Everybody, it's Larry Kotlikoff back with Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted to have Jim, Jim Conroy, as my guest today. Thanks for coming, Jim. Jim is the author of this brand new book from Simon and Schuster. I'm not sure how exactly when it came out, but it's quite new. The Devils Will Get No Rest. FDR, Churchill, and the Plan That Won the War. It's about the Casablanca Conference when the Allies invaded North Africa prior to later on invading Normandy. So this was really the beginning of the US's involvement in the war in Europe against the Nazis. What does this have to do with economics? Well, I think, our economic world and everything else about our world would be different had the US not gotten involved to fight against Germany and Japan in World War II. So it's good to, it's tangentially involved with economics, but obviously there's lots of economic issues involved in running a major war. But let me just tell you a little bit about Jim, because he is an unusual person. He's had multiple careers, and one of the things I've been trying to emphasize to, especially to younger, but I also want to emphasize to older viewers and listeners to this podcast, is that you guys, everybody can do anything they want. That we're not stuck in our ways. Jim has become a fabulous author of history just in the last 10 years. So this is like his third career, and I'm just going to have Jim tell us about his book writing career and history of, but he started out his career, and I'm just going to kind of briefly summarize it, serving 6 years in the US Naval Air Reserve. Then he worked on Capitol Hill as a speechwriter, press secretary, and a chief of staff in the 70s and early 80s. Then he earns a master's degree in international relations at George Washington University. And then he goes on to get a distinguished law degree, magna cum laude, at Georgetown University Law Center. And then he becomes a co-founder of Donnelly, Conroy, and Gelhar LLP, one of Boston's leading litigation firms. He practices law for 38 years until just 4 years ago. Let's see, his bio also says he enjoys following national politics as well as the Boston Celtics. Thank God for the Celtics, huh? And the New England Patriots sometimes, but yeah, I'm a huge Boston Celtics fans, as are my sons. But Jim lives in Hingham, Mass, not too far from Providence, where I'm living. His wife of 50 years is Lynn Fitzgerald Conroy, and he has a daughter and a son, also have accomplished careers. And so he's got quite the background. But then he told me, I just asked him a second ago, Jim, you've written 3 books, and one sounds more interesting than the next. I've been reading, I got about halfway through The Devils Will Get No Rest, which is probably Churchill talking to FDR at the Casablanca Conference. That must be the quote. I haven't gotten to that part, so I haven't gotten through the whole book yet, but I'm finding it a real page turner. Don't have a whole lot of time to read books, to tell you the truth, but this one grabbed me. But Jim has also written several other books. In 2014, Our One Common Country, Abraham Lincoln and the Hampton Roads Peace Conference of 1865, the only book ever devoted to Lincoln's little-known peace negotiations with Confederate leaders on a riverboat in Virginia near the end of the Civil War. Our One Common Country was a finalist for the Gilder Lehman Lincoln Prize, awarded to the author of the best book of the year on Lincoln. a Civil War soldier or the Civil War era. Jim's second book, Lincoln's White House, The People's House in Wartime, was a co-winner of the Lincoln Prize and won the Abraham Lincoln Institute's annual book award. Leading Jefferson historians have applauded Jim's third book. Actually, so this is now your fourth book, Jefferson's White House, Monticello on the Potomac. And the new book, The Devils Will Get No Rest, from Simon & Schuster, which is really our top publisher. They've published several of my books, so I'm a fellow Simon & Schuster author like you, as I said about the Casablanca Conference. But the most amazing thing is that Jim started writing now his 4 history books, extraordinary books, just 10 years ago when you were 45. So
if only.
Jim, how is it that whatever age you started this at, you're still in the middle of your law firm, running your law firm, which is, doing extremely well in Boston, I take it, if it's one of the leading Boston litigation firms. How is it you decide that you want to be, start writing history books, and then how is it that you are able to write history books that start winning awards and get published by Simon & Schuster? This is not, everybody gets turned down by Simon & Schuster. I don't know if this is the first Simon & Schuster book or the fourth, but tell us about how you get into this, and then we're going to talk about this really cool book and maybe the other books if we have time, okay?
Sure. Well, thank you for all that very generous introduction. I will tell you that I got turned down by at least a dozen publishers with my first book, even though I had an agent, a terrific agent in New York. So anybody out there listening who has a book in him or her, and I suspect there are more than 2 or 3, go to it, stick with it. And
We should mention your current agent's name is
Alice Martell.
who is also
Alice
my
Martell.
agent and
Okay.
my good dear friend for decades, and she's one of the top agents in New York. And she will tell you that this is a very tough industry to get things published in, but she's fantastic. And if anybody can get the publishers to pay attention, it's Alice Martell. But go ahead.
Well, she's the best. That's why I'm here. Without her, I would never have written any books. But long story short, I have wanted to write history since I was about 7 or 8 years old. It's been a lifelong ambition. I've always been fascinated by history, particularly American history. And, I was also fascinated by politics, still am, sadly enough. And after college, went down to DC and started a career down there, first working for some public interest groups and then as staff on Capitol Hill. It was great. I enjoyed it very much, but toward the end of it, about 9 years, I was kind of burned out with all of that, which people tend to be. And so I got my law degree, and my wife and I moved here up near Boston, practiced law in Boston for 38 years. And as I got older and I started looking at retirement, I'm thinking, well, what I really want to do is write history books. And little vignette here, my son, who was a political reporter at the time in his early 20s, wrote a book about Sarah Palin, who he had covered as a CBS news correspondent, young kid, 22 or 3, riding on her campaign airplane with her all the time. So he wrote a book about that. And Alice was his agent, which is how I got connected to Alice.
I see, great.
And, I just encourage everybody out there who thinks they'd like to write a book or, have tried and put it aside, stick to it and keep it up. And you too can be on a podcast like this someday. So that's my
Well,
message.
I mean, it's, I would say, and I too can have such a fantastic guest on my podcast. Alice sent me your book, so that's how we connected. And so you've written books about kind of specific episodes in history that in great detail. So a book like the one, The Devils Will Get No Rest, which is a thick book, it's got all these pages, but it's a page turner, no question about it. Fascinating. Uh, and you go into all the details about all the different personalities, all the different generals and admirals, and how the British and the American are getting along, and how the British, uh, well, take us through whatever you can tell us about the book without giving away uh, too much of the punchline.
Well, you know what? I have an answer to that off the bat that I always give people. Everybody knows how World War II turned out. So there's not a whole lot of suspense, involved in the ultimate outcome. What really fascinates me, and I think most people, is the human beings involved in this. It's a character-driven book. It's not a statistical book or a, kind of dry recitation of how many destroyers were produced in 1942 or that kind of thing. People who are into that can look it up. But what interests me is the tremendous personalities and character of these top military and political leaders of the free world in 1943 at the turning point of the war, from one of what a British general called hanging on by our eyelids, up through 1942, to planning the offensive stage of the war, which is what the Casablanca Conference was about. And, I was casting around for a book topic some years back when I happened to watch a documentary on the History Channel about the Casablanca Conference. And the bottom line on it was that if you've got for 10 days enclosed in a barbed wire compound in a war zone in Morocco, you've got FDR, Churchill, Eisenhower, George Marshall, Patton, Mountbatten, Alexander, Averell Harriman, just goes on and on. These tremendous, towering personalities, Charles de Gaulle, all, in a 10-day span together in this little compound in a war zone. I thought there's got to be a story there. And it turned out that there was.
So, so to research this book, I mean, you have kind of a day by day or even hour by hour, it's really hour by hour description of, although that's not the way it kind of reads. It's not like this happened at this minute, this happened. But you have a kind of a extremely detailed understanding that you've acquired by must be incredible research to understand who was talking to who during what days and what part of the conference, and also what was being said to each other. How do you get all that information? Where do you come up with all that information about the disagreements, who changed their minds, how they came around, who befriended who, what did people think of each other? What did the British say on the side about the Americans? What were the Americans saying on the side about the British? Because there wasn't full trust here right at the beginning.
Well, I always analogize it to a mosaic or a jigsaw puzzle. What I do is I start by reading the secondary sources about the subject. First of all, try to pick a subject that hasn't been done to death, or actually in all four cases hasn't been done at all, which is hard to do. But find something that hasn't been done and something that's got a lot of human interest is the first task. Then the second task is to start reading whatever secondary sources there are that discuss the subject, usually in a paragraph or two or a page in a much longer book, and then get a sense of what happened, what the drift of it was, and then dive into the primary sources, the letters, diaries, minutes of these meetings, photographs, interviews after the war, correspondence between the players, all of that sort of thing. And I put it down in outline form on my laptop. Three outlines, really. One is a chronology of events. The second is called characters, where I just lay out everything I can find about these people. And then the third is a general outline of subject matters and topics. And as I read all these things, I slug that information into those three outlines so that by the time I'm done, I've got a pretty good comprehensive jigsaw puzzle laid out in front of me with the pieces where they belong. And then comes the part of writing it. The first draft or two is very hard work. Nobody's looking over your shoulder. There's no time clock. So you have to discipline yourself to get up every morning and sit down and do this. But after that first draft or two, then it becomes fun again, because then you can polish and edit and put it all together. So that's the process, essentially.
And to get all this kind of these diaries and so forth, is this all at the public library or is it online, or how do you actually access this?
Well, many of these players wrote memoirs, and a good number of them had diaries. The memoirs, of course, are published. They're out of print, almost all of them, with some exceptions, but they were published typically in the late 40s, early 50s, and they had their day and faded away. So people haven't read them for decades. There's that. And then the second thing is, in fact, the internet and working with archivists. I did this during the height of COVID, so I was restricted, in ability to visit archives, most of which were closed until very toward the end of the book. But archivists and librarians were very helpful online and on the phone. And unpublished diaries also are out there, in archives, libraries, and papers of famous people. One British officer, relatively junior, Brigadier General, which passed for junior at the Casablanca Conference, wrote a 25-page narrative of what he saw and heard at the conference that's never been published. It's sitting in the archives at the Churchill archives, in England. So that's a lot of fun. I enjoy doing that, learn a lot, get to feel for these people and how they interact, what they thought of each other. And that's really the drift of the piece. I try to write history like a novel, is basically what it
Did you
comes
actually go to Casablanca to see?
I planned to, but again, it was high COVID, pre-vaccine. So I didn't think it was a great idea to go to Morocco, in that situation. So we didn't get to do that, but I hope someday to get there.
So give us a setting. So here it is, 19. We have Pearl Harbor. Then it's really quite a while until the U.S. is engaging militarily with the Japanese and having victories after Pearl Harbor. So that's confidence boosting and also allows more resources to be shifted towards Europe. But it takes quite a while here for the U.S. to get engaged militarily in Europe. And one of the interesting things I realized in reading your book is that there wasn't just kind of an invasion of North Africa by the Allies, Morocco, but also Algeria. That, as you told me, as the book indicates, and as you told me in person on the phone, the Americans kind of landed in Morocco, I guess with some British support, but also the British landed independently in Algeria, I guess Algiers. So we had, and if you look at a map of North Africa, that's a long way from Tunisia. Both Algeria and Morocco are a long, long way away from Tunisia, where Rommel at this point has come in to rescue the Italians with German divisions. And so the folks at Casablanca, the FDR and Churchill, seemed, from your description, again, I've only read the first half of the book, so I apologize, but they seemed very confident about their ability to beat the Germans and to then beat the Germans in North Africa, but also invade Europe, start a second Western Front, and beat the Germans in Europe, even though the Germans had just wiped out the French and kicked the British off the continent. And they had many, many divisions on the West, as well as fighting in Russia. Of course, they were beginning to lose in Russia. So where's all this confidence coming from, I guess, is my question, one of my questions.
Well, to start with North Africa, the Allies planned in the summer of 1942 to invade North Africa together. And the reasons for that, which they accomplished really marvelously in a very short time. And the reason for that was that there were no German troops in Morocco, Algeria, or Tunisia at the time. They were all French. The deal that the French had made with the Germans when they surrendered in 1940 included keeping their empire and keeping their military forces in North Africa. So the thought was that, the French really are sympathetic to the Allies. They hate the Germans. Once we land there, hopefully they won't resist and they'll just join us and we'll then be poised to take the next step up into Europe. Well, the French did resist under orders from the Vichy government, which is basically a puppet German government, but only for 2 days. It was almost as if they felt they had to vindicate their honor to defend their territory. But after 2 days of fighting, which killed 1,500 Americans, by the way, people don't remember that we fought the French. But after North Africa was taken, with the exception of Tunisia, there was a vast Anglo-American army in the western side of North Africa, Morocco and Algeria, and there were also substantial British forces in Egypt. So the thought was, where Rommel was stationed at the time. So the thought was that the British would push Rommel from the east and the Americans would push from the west and catch him in between in Tunisia and, prevail, which is what they did. They heavily outnumbered the Germans in North Africa. It's the only place.
What to what? I mean, when you say outnumbered, can you give us some sense of the dimensions of our troops versus theirs, or our tanks versus theirs?
Yeah, if you asked me that 2 years ago, I'd have been able to tell you, but I've frankly forgotten the numbers and I don't want to make them up. But there was a great superiority in Allied force in North Africa over the Germans. Hitler reinforced Tunisia immediately as soon as that invasion started. And it was not easy. It took many months to beat the Germans in Tunisia. But the Allies were confident they were going to do that. So and they did eventually. So the next step would be, okay, now we've got this big Anglo-American army in North Africa. What are we going to do with it? Are we either going to go up, bring them back up to England and cross the Channel in 1943, which is what the Americans wanted to do? Or are we going to start in the Mediterranean, use that North African force nearby in the Mediterranean, take Sicily, which is what they ultimately did do, and then thereby open the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, and make the Germans start pulling troops from Russia and from northern France, because we'll attack them where they're weakest, where we outnumber them, in Sicily, and then cross to the toe of Italy, 2 miles away, and start making the Germans fight us where we want to fight them and pull them away from Russia, pull them away from northern France. And then a year from now, we'll cross the Channel in 1944. And that's the ultimate outcome. But the fascination of the Casablanca Conference, I think, is the arguments that went on, the not shouting arguments, although there were some that people lost their cool occasionally, but there were logical military, discussions about what works, what doesn't, why we should do this or not that. And, these are all five-star egos. You've got the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the American side, the British Chiefs of Staff, none of whom are used to being told they're wrong. And then they sit opposite each other in a little conference room for 10 days, telling each other how wrong they are. So it's really an interesting exercise in human psychology as well.
And the Americans were more interested in, even though they had come to North Africa, because I guess they weren't at all prepared yet to invade mainland Europe, they wanted to move much more rapidly to cross into to invade France, either from the south or from the east. But the British were very concerned because the Germans had lots of divisions. It seemed many more divisions than the Allies could put together for such an endeavor. Why wasn't that, correct me if I'm wrong in this description, but why wasn't that immediately apparent to the Americans that this doesn't make any sense? Well, that the British actually were saying the realistic things, and that it wasn't really a matter of British versus American, who's going to be in charge here, but rather just the realities of the practical realities of what you could accomplish how quickly, in the short run versus the long run?
Well, there's a few things to say about that. First, we need to keep in mind that the world was a different place in 1943, in January of 43, including England and the United States. No internet, no television, no radio, no common newspapers or magazines to speak of. Very distinct cultures and countries, British imperialists, American anti-imperialists, still a pretty common American perception of the British as the red-coated devils, as one American officer remembered being taught. So there was kind of a tension and an animosity even there. Secondly, the British had been a world power for 300 years. The Americans had never been a world power until the Spanish-American War, and then only in a modest way. And between the wars, stuck their head in the sand and became isolationist and had no real role in world affairs. So vastly more sophisticated are the British, vastly more experienced, and incredibly better prepared. That's a key point. The Americans brought 7 officers, including the Joint Chiefs, to Casablanca. The British brought 75, and a headquarters ship packed with all kinds of War Department papers and experts and the rest. So they were hugely better prepared, had thought it all through much more carefully than the Americans had. And, American military doctrine, to simplify it, perhaps too much, but not inaccurately, came from the thinking of Ulysses S. Grant, which is that you hit the enemy hard wherever he is and however strong he is, and you just keep hitting him and taking casualties and inflicting casualties until he breaks down and you win. I mean, that's essentially the American approach. So their thought was, we'll cross the channel, even though we're not really prepared for that, and we'll just drive right on to Berlin because we're Americans. And the British were not convinced by that, having been driven out of France with their tails between their legs. The Germans were vastly more prepared militarily than the Allies were. Terrific soldiers, leaders, weapons, equipment, training, all superior to the Allies. So a very tough nut to crack.
So did Roosevelt share this? Was it really the opinion or the naivete of the American military at let's say at the outset, or was that also Roosevelt's? Was Roosevelt like really stuck on the idea of invading France in 43 when he arrives at Casablanca, or was he kind of just sitting back, listening, and trying to?
FDR, first of all, was not a military guy. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, but had not played a major role in strategy or anything of that kind. He'd never been in the military. He was interested, particularly in the Navy. He was a real naval advocate, but he really didn't know a whole lot about military strategy, very little about infantry, armor, and aircraft. He learned when he had to in 1939 when the war started, but he didn't have the depth that Churchill had. Churchill was a real military expert, had gone through Sandhurst, the West Point of Britain, fought in 3 wars, held all sorts of important wartime jobs in World War I, and of course in World War II. So there was this great imbalance, of sophistication there as well. But FDR was open-minded, I think, is the most efficient way to describe it. He didn't have a rigid thought about, how we're going to play this chess game out. He deferred largely to Marshall, but he did have a general grand strategic design in mind. It was he and Churchill who had pushed for the North African invasion, which turned out to be a huge success. And he understood that, we didn't have the troops and the shipping and the, what it would take to invade France in 1943. But, Marshall was dead in favor of it, and he didn't want to buck that system. But I think he just let things play out as the military hashed all these things out in their own conference room and, kind of floated along with the tide, more or less.
Let's talk about these personalities. I'm getting the impression that Marshall, who's, this is Marshall of the Marshall Plan, which was obviously a brilliant thing to do for conception of rebuilding Western Europe to confront economically so that they would be able to be a bulwark against the Soviet Union against Stalin. So he's credited with that brilliant Marshall Plan. I don't know whether it really originated with him, but anyway, he's got the name on it. But your book kind of gives me the impression that Marshall wasn't such a great military leader or thinker, but he's our head of the Joint Chiefs, right?
Yeah, well, actually, he wasn't formally the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but by sheer force of character and personality, he dominated that group. Two things to say about Marshall in brevity. One is that he was a tremendous force of personality. Dean Acheson, Truman's Secretary of State after after Marshall, said that when Marshall walked into the room, his very presence was a striking and communicated force, that he just had this presence, command presence about him. When he walked into his country club for dinner, everybody would stand up. I mean, this is the kind of guy George Marshall was. So he had that great force of character. He was not a brilliant man. He never would have claimed he was a brilliant man. He was very good at organization, at putting together a vast army, the vast army that won the war. It was he who conceived of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and also of a combined high command of the British and the Americans, all of which was crucial. So he was important for all those reasons, but he was not a brilliant strategist, never claimed to be, whereas many of the British were, notably the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Alan Brooke, who I think of as kind of the hero of the book, actually, who was really steeped in military strategy, a brilliant analyst of it, and masterminded the whole approach that the Allies eventually took.
I see. And was Marshall kind of dug in? Did he take, were there arguments? Was he sounded like he kind of was persuasive without screaming, that he could be that he was a rather dignified person. This is the impression I'm getting.
Uh-huh.
But does he arrive at Casablanca saying this is the way it's going to be, and then the British have to turn him around, or or is it just some of the other people that had that perception that,
Well,
this is what we should do?
it was sort of in between. Marshall believed that the best tactic would be to cross the channel in 43, that even if it failed, they would drain the British resource, I mean the German resources, bleed the Germans and be ready to hit them harder the next time. But he wasn't, radically committed to that. No fanaticism about it. That was his, general sense of things. But he was willing to be persuaded, and indeed was persuaded ultimately at Casablanca, that that was not the right approach, and that going up through the Mediterranean was the right approach. So I think he deserves great credit for being able to admit that he had misjudged it, and that, the British were right and he was wrong. So that takes character and courage.
Right. And so at the beginning of this meeting, the British and the Americans are kind of wary of each other, I think. Uh, the British think the Americans are kind of unprepared and let's say militarily illiterate or something, I guess. And the Americans, I guess, are concerned that the British are just interested in the Americans saving their hides and not,
In their empire.
what?
And their empire.
Their empire, and not helping the U.S. after after the defeat of Germany with defeating the Japanese, which I guess was largely the case. That the British never fought the Japanese in a significant way, although they did lose some major warships. I guess the Prince of Wales was
Wales, yeah,
in
yeah.
right at the beginning of the Japanese war effort. The with probably 3,000 people died or some huge number of deaths. So anyway, so at the end of the meeting, the 10 days, I take it that the British and the Americans have, for the most part, become pretty good friends. That they're trusting each other. That this was like summer camp in some ways, and that this was really important in that sense. Am I correct?
Yes, the great military historian Rick Atkinson referred to the Casablanca Conference as a hinge on which history swung when the Americans, were stopped being the junior partners and began to be, a major player and would soon be the major player. The British knew that, the industrial power, the manpower, the agriculture, the industry, all of that was overwhelming in America. And the idea was if we can hang on long enough for the American power to be built up and brought to bear, then we're going to win this war. So, the British understood and recognized the importance of the American role. And certainly the Americans appreciated what the British had done, hanging on as they had alone for so long against Hitler. But the difference at Casablanca was largely atmospheric. There had been several conferences before in Washington, in Canada, and in London among high military commanders on both sides. But in each of those cases, whoever the home team was, would go back home or to their offices after the meetings, and the visitors would go to their hotels, and they never really interacted on a personal level. Whereas at Casablanca, they were surrounded by barbed wire for 10 days in a hotel. They ate together, they drank together, they sat around in each other's rooms like college freshmen. Friendships formed, understanding developed, mutual respect developed. And it really is the beginning of that special relationship between the British and the Americans. It was no longer an alliance of convenience. It now became, much more of a common effort when they knew and liked and understood each other. By and large, there were still some tensions, but they knew each other better and liked each other generally.
Let me ask you a few questions about the actual campaign in North Africa. So by the time Casablanca, the meeting begins, we have the British having pushed the Italians out of, Libya, and then the Germans send in Rommel to rescue the Italians or rescue the situation. But then there's Montgomery, I guess, under Alexander, is successfully, maybe you can fill us in on
Sure.
what happens in the British campaign prior to and then subsequent. I'd be very interested in a couple things here. Kind of how does this campaign in North Africa develop? A lot of Americans don't know we even invaded North Africa. I didn't really even know that that the Allies invaded Algeria at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But we're talking about invading in like Quebec, Canada, to go fight in Miami, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah, well,
it's that far away. Let's make sure we're all safe in Quebec, but then we'll have some people, let's say, invade in New York where there's also no Germans, but the Germans are down in Miami. And what happened before, and then how does the whole campaign evolve, and how does my particular interest in here is in how good a military leader and strategist Montgomery was compared to Patton, and how each of them performed, because Patton has this tremendous reputation as being our best commander in World War II, and Montgomery has the counterpart reputation for the British. And are these well deserved? You're kind of an expert who can tell us the answer to that.
well, to start with, the situation in North Africa in 1942, before the conference, Rommel and his Africa Corps, the famous Africa Corps, very hardened, well-armed, well-trained, well-led military force, had finally been defeated in Egypt at El Alamein by a British army under Montgomery's effective command. And that was a tremendous morale booster for the British. They had yet to defeat the Germans anywhere except in the Battle of Britain, which was a defensive battle. Every time they had fought the Germans, they had come out on the short end, and this was their first big victory in the fall of 1942. So that was a great morale booster. And
What was the
Montgomery,
key? Just if I could ask you, what was the key to that victory at El Alamein, in your view?
well, first of all, I can't say candidly that I'm an expert on that because that predates the conference. I have read a lot about it, and in essence, Montgomery made tremendous use of his tank forces, in the open desert against Rommel and his. Rommel, the Desert Fox, they called him, was the leading world figure in the command of tank warfare. And Montgomery was relatively little known at the time. He hadn't really done anything monumental, but he just did a masterful use of what he had. One of the things I thought was really interesting was he came up with the idea of stripping all the tanks and armored vehicles from half of his army, putting them in the other half, and having this tremendous striking force, hit Rommel unexpectedly with that souped up group. So he gained tremendous prestige and fame as a result of that battle. He was not at Casablanca because he was still fighting the Germans in Tunisia when the Casablanca Conference was held. But the main point about North Africa, I think, well, let me do Patton quickly. Patton commanded the American invasion force that took North Africa. He too had been obscure, very little known. Some interesting stuff about him. He was a very wealthy guy from Los Angeles, from a wealthy family, had been a pentathlete at the Olympics, and has a colorful background. Everybody knows Blood and Guts Patton, I guess, because of George C. Scott, if nothing else, in the movie. But at Casablanca, he was put in the unlikely role of cruise director. I mean, he was in charge of the accommodations and the food and the transportation and all of that, and was not in the conference, was not one of the conferees. I think FDR knew that his talent was in a tank and not at a table, so he didn't really participate in that. The Montgomery Patton thing really comes into focus, after the invasion when they're pushing the Germans toward Berlin, and the idea is who's going to get the most fuel and the most tanks and the most support. Is it going to be Montgomery or Patton? And Patton had the slapping incident where he slapped a wounded young man in a hospital, actually not wounded, but psychologically damaged. And Patton thought that was sheer cowardice and slapped the kid. The newspapers went wild, and Patton had to be sort of pulled back from the spotlight. Montgomery was a brilliant military strategist and tactician. I think Patton less so. Patton was just not just, because it's a lot to say, but Patton had such courage and audacity and confidence that, those are high qualities for a military leader, particularly on the offense, which is what made Patton's reputation.
So during this campaign and to defeat Rommel, I mean, how much of it was Patton versus Montgomery after Patton starts engaging? What does he does he have any great victories that were more than just sheer numbers against the Germans? Our side outweighing the Germans in terms of military equipment and troops. Or does Patton have some great strategic moves during this campaign, in your view?
To be honest with you, I really hesitate to get deeply into that because that's after the Casablanca conference. And, as you've mentioned on my 4 books, they're on 4 different topics. I don't have any, focus on one period or one person. So, whoops.
Did we lose you there?
Hello.
Jim, hi, it's Stephanie from the Martel Agency calling you on my cell phone. I'm working from home today.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of a podcast. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
Okay.
just want to know if your wire transfer is the same so I can send you the money from Simon Schuster.
Yeah, it's the same. Thank you.
All right, that's all I need to know. Have a good podcast. Sorry, bye.
That's Stephanie.
It's okay. I didn't mean to interrupt your podcast. I'll let you go.
Jim, can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Sorry about that. I don't
That's
know how
okay.
that happened.
That's Stephanie. She's just trying to take care of you.
It is. I hope
Not
you
a
can edit
problem.
that out.
What?
I hope
Yeah,
you can edit that out.
we can, or you know what? This is so casual. We don't really care.
Okay.
We have these kinds of things in all the podcasts, and it's just, we're trying to show people the way they are, not the way life is, not
Well,
this is
that
not
succeeded.
this is not Hollywood, and minor glitches is part of the story here. But so yeah, I haven't, I've never really heard, and uh, I can appreciate you did so much work on the conference that following exactly that'll maybe be the next book, whether Patton really deserves his reputation or not. I think that would be of great interest, or whether. But at the beginning, it sounded like a beginning of our engagement, and also with Eisenhower, whether Eisenhower deserves a great reputation. Uh, but apart from organization, and maybe that's whether that's Marshall or Eisenhower or the combination, uh, but or whether it's Bradley. Bradley was also one of the major commanders with Patton. But at the beginning of the Casablanca Conference, Eisenhower is closer to the Germans, I guess, than certainly he's in Algeria, right? At that
Right.
point,
Algiers, yeah.
he flies into, and I think there were some setbacks by in our first attempt to fight with the Germans. There were some defeats here, right, at the beginning.
Oh yeah. Well, the invasion itself of North Africa was tremendously successful. It's hard to believe, but they actually sailed the American fleet directly from Hampton Roads, Virginia, right to Casablanca. No stops in between. And after that long ocean passage, they hit the beach and took North Africa in very short order. So that was a great success, or I should say, took Algeria and Morocco. But when it came time to fight Rommel in the desert, there were big defeats. Most of the early battles were defeats, and there were several well-publicized defeats. But over time, largely by sheer force of numbers and by being pressed from both sides, Rommel was defeated. His army surrendered. He had to evacuate to Germany to keep from being captured himself. And that was really a turning point, if not the turning point of the war in Europe.
And the decision to go after defeating or kicking the Germans out of North Africa, the decision to invade Sicily versus Sardinia, since I haven't gotten to the entire, again, finish the book, that also is made at Casablanca?
Yes. Once the debate was pretty much settled about we're going to go through the Med rather than cross the channel, the next issue is where are we going to go in the Med? And there was division even within the British ranks on only one point, and that was whether to go for Sicily or Sardinia. Sicily was the bigger prize and, very important to opening up shipping in the Mediterranean. If you just visualize its place on the map, it's pretty much in the middle of the Mediterranean, and very important to get that naval and air base for opening up the Med to shipping. Sardinia would have been a better target for airfields and for access to the upper end of the Italian boot. And people still debate to this day which was the better choice, but they certainly did at Casablanca as well. But Sicily turned out to be a great success and really got the Allies, sustained on a winning track after winning, as Montgomery had at El Alamein.
I forget whether Malta, which is right next to Sicily, so we got Italy, next door is Sicily, and then we got Malta, maybe 30 miles away, 30 kilometers
Yeah,
away.
Malta was under British control and had been throughout the war. It was always vulnerable, but Hitler never attacked there, and the British kept Malta throughout the war.
I think one interesting factoid about Malta that I've read is that it was the most heavily bombed uh, set of square miles of any place in World War II.
Interesting.
That received a huge amount of bombing from the Germans. Uh, the
By the way, the Germans had bombed Casablanca 2 weeks before the conference from bases in southern France. So it was really, I almost want to say reckless, but certainly daring to put the entire Allied High Command in one place, within a square mile, in an easy range of the Luftwaffe 2 weeks after they'd bombed the place. It was just sheer secrecy that kept them from wiping out, decapitating the entire Allied leadership.
So with all these people and all this movement and German spies and French collaborators with the Nazis not nearby, and then you've got the population in Morocco, people, obviously on all sides here, subject to coercion and bribery. The fact that the Germans don't find out about this at all, I guess, right?
Yeah, there's a little interesting story about that. Casablanca was full of spies, as anybody who's seen the movie with Humphrey Bogart would remember. And one of those spies was a Spanish national who communicated with the Germans in Spanish, and somehow or other had found out or figured out that the high command was meeting in Casablanca, and sent a telegram to Berlin in Spanish that said Churchill and FDR are meeting in Casablanca. And some poor German officer translated Casablanca as White House. So the Germans were under the impression that FDR and Churchill were in Washington. But for that one mistake, the war may have turned out differently. It's amazing how history turns on little things.
Is it possible, you probably know about this Operation Mincemeat, where
Right.
when when the Allies were preparing to invade Sicily, they wanted to give the Germans the impression that they're going to invade Greece, and to get the Germans to move military equipment away, and I guess also some of the Air Force towards that front. And the British secretly landed a dead airman on by submarine. They took a corpse and put a briefcase attached to the corpse's arm, and they had it wash up on the beach in Spain. And then inside the briefcase is these instructions about the fact, or this divulgence, that the invasion is going to be of Greece, and that this thing gets sent to the German, head of security, of intelligence, who, from my reading of the book and seeing, I guess there was a movie, that this guy was actually basically a double agent for the Allies, that he was opposed to Hitler and withheld the information from Hitler, or just maybe just either downplayed it to the point where Hitler didn't believe it. So it's possible that that he got involved in keeping this information from. He might have said, well, might have retranslated this missive about where this meeting was happening and sent it over to the German High Command. Are you familiar with that German intelligence officer, who's apparently the head of the intelligence system? Are you familiar with that story?
I am, yeah. I read the book and saw the movie. It's quite interesting. That had not occurred to me, actually. It's possible, I suppose. Maybe, who knows? I guess we'll never know.
Yeah, but it was pretty crazy, these guys, to do this. I mean, they could have gone to some other safer place, right?
Well, the thought was that because of this vast Anglo-American army in North Africa, all of the senior commanders were nearby. The Naval, Air, and Army were all within a few hours flight of Casablanca, so that's why they picked it. From the record, it doesn't look to me as if they spent a whole lot of time worrying about the security. It's kind of bizarre. I mean, they did surround the whole site with a mile of barbed wire and had tanks and anti-aircraft guns and elite American troops and British Marines and fighter planes overhead to protect them. But it was like, a neon sign saying something big is happening here. So come and bomb this place. It's really pretty amazing that it panned out as it did.
Wow, yeah, that would have been quite something had we lost those leaders. So let's just we have a couple minutes left here. We're kind of at the beginning of an election. President Biden has just debated President Trump in what looks to be historic moment in time, because his debate performance suggested that he's ill, gravely ill, actually, not just having, some people are claiming he had a cold, but the next day he's kind of back on his feet. But his performance of not being able to string together three words, and we have the President Trump spewing his view of world history. I guess I would describe it as lying about his lying. I mean, he's enhancing his lying. Lying enhancement would be. So we have kind of a turning point in history. Is there anything that we can learn about the American situation right now, that maybe about leadership, about whether or not Biden should be dropping out of the race? That's the current debate. I don't know, the people that view this might be viewing this in a year after Biden has decided to stay in. Maybe Trump's taken over or not. Maybe he's extracted at retribution. Maybe I'm in jail and you're in jail or not. I don't know what your politics are, but certainly I've said enough things against Trump that I could be put into jail if that's what he's after, if he's able to do that. But do you have any kind of messages about for us about the importance of leadership for the evolution of history, and we're also having a major potential war between Iran and Hezbollah, and thanks to the invasion of Israel by Hamas. So that could break into a major conflagration. And then we have the Russians trying to take over Ukraine. How do you view, do you think in these kind of, when you're kind of not focused on a narrow topic like you are in these books, do you have some insights into world affairs that these other experiences from history kind of can provide for us?
Well, first of all, to put my cards on the table, I'm a lifelong Democrat. I used to be a professional Democrat, and my sympathies are uncomplicated. So we should start with that. But secondly, leaving aside for the moment the debate and where that all stands, because that's still very much in flux as we speak, I think it's crucial to remember history when it comes to most particularly Ukraine at this point. I was born in 1949, and Israel and Palestine has been a mess throughout my entire life. I've followed it pretty closely, and I've almost come to the point of giving up on the idea of that being solvable in my lifetime. It's a huge tragedy, but it seems almost out of control no matter who's in charge. Ukraine is different. I think, I see Ukraine as the shadow of Poland, in 1939, that The Americans felt like an ocean was going to protect them from being involved in the European war, isolationist between the wars, resisting any idea to come in and get involved in Europe. Well, as Biden said recently, there's never been a major war in Europe that did not involve America as well. It's not possible. And when Putin, has been checked and frustrated as he has in Ukraine, and Ukraine depending on American support to resist that, I think is the defining issue of world history today. And it's not left or right, it's not Republican or Democratic, it's not liberal or conservative. It's a question of, is the free world going to stand up to the authoritarian world or not? And is Putin going to roll over Ukraine when the next administration comes in, and then, the Baltics and Poland and whatever else? We'll be back where we were in 1939. And it boggles my mind that anyone could see it differently. So that's a partisan view, but it's also based on a lot of reading and a lot of history. That's my take.
My take too. So Jim Conroy, the book is The Devils Will Get No Rest. It's a page turner. It's a fantastic book. You will learn something new on every page. You'll learn about the personalities of all the great figures of World War II, and you'll learn about leadership and about compromise and about how decisions actually get made that affect us all. And thank you so much for having written this, and thanks for coming on, Jim.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity.